The defeat of the French in 1954 in the First Indochina War led to the dissolution of French Indochina and the independence of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. But Vietnam was temporarily subdivided at the 17th parallel into a communist north and a non-communist south. Elections were planned for 1956 to resolve the division. Thousands of Vietnamese migrated in a population exchange. Communists went north, Roman Catholics moved south. Opposed to the communist north, the United States began providing economic and military aid, and supported South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem's refusal to hold the elections, believing that the North's Ho Chi Minh would win. North Vietnam then encouraged communist organization in the South through the former Viet Minh who had fought the French, and supplied them through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The South became a battleground for a long and treacherous guerrilla war. In 1960, North Vietnam announced the formation of the Viet Cong and the National Liberation Front. Concerned that there would be a domino effect, President Kennedy expanded military and economic aid. By 1962, over 11,000 advisors and special forces were in Vietnam to support the ARVN, the Army of South Vietnam. But despite this support, the Army was defeated by the Viet Cong in a battle at Ap Pac in January 1963. Diem caused more problems with his persecution of Buddhist monks. On November 1st, the U.S. supported a military coup that overthrew Diem. A series of coups provided opportunities for Hanoi. Viet Cong activity increased as northern regulars began moving south. August 2, 1964 was a turning point in the war. North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked a U.S. destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin. At President Lyndon Johnson's urging, Congress authorized retaliatory military operations with the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. The door to a wider war had been opened. A Viet Cong attack on U.S. Army barracks at Pleiku triggered Operation Rolling Thunder, a restricted but massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Then, on March 8, 1965, the first U.S. combat troops landed at Da Nang. These were the early steps in a massive 4-year escalation by President Johnson that would ultimately bring hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops. Rather than a classic military strategy of gaining territory and setting battle lines, the Army tried to clear areas with search and destroy missions. At the same time, B-52s joined the bombing campaign on the north, flying from bases in Guam and Thailand. The U.S. strategy had been to demoralize the Communists through a war of attrition by incurring heavy casualties. But this strategy did not take into account that Hanoi was prepared to suffer enormous losses and still keep the level of infiltration at 7,000 men a month. Because the U.S. did not have enough troops for occupation, and rural pacification was unsuccessful, the countryside was never secure. By late 1967, the war was at a stalemate. Hanoi began a new offensive that started with the siege of Khe Sanh and diversionary attacks on provincial capitals. On January 30th, the lunar holiday, Hanoi's true plan unfolded. The Tet Offensive, a full-scale attack on cities lasting for 3 weeks. The longest and most difficult fighting occurred at Hue. Though the Communists lost 40,000 men, Tet proved that they were not near defeat. With Johnson's withdrawal from the presidential race and his own ensuing election, President Nixon was keenly aware of the war's unpopularity. He was also determined to stop the Communists. He pursued the policy of Vietnamization to reduce direct U.S. involvement and allow troop withdrawals. He also expanded the fighting front. In April 1970, U.S. and ARVN forces attacked Communist sanctuaries in Cambodia. And in February 1971, ARVN forces invaded Laos in an attempt to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The failure of negotiations in 1971 led to another attempt at a military solution. In March 1972, Hanoi launched a major conventional invasion of the South, the Easter Offensive. At first the North was successful, routing ARVN troops and overrunning Quang Tri Province, but U.S. air power slowed their offensive. With few U.S. troops remaining, and even fewer combat ready, Nixon took the air attack to the north, targeting Hanoi and Haiphong in the hope that an agreement could be reached before the U.S. presidential election. It didn't work, but the Easter Offensive finally halted. After he was elected, Nixon ordered the massive Christmas bombing of December 1972 to pressure Hanoi back to negotiation. It worked. Hanoi was badly damaged and Congress was angry. Both sides were ready to negotiate. The Paris Accord, signed on January 31, 1973, brought U.S. withdrawal and the return of the POWs, but the major issue of who would govern was not resolved. Fighting continued in South Vietnam, but with Nixon's Watergate crisis and a lack of congressional support, aid declined to the weakening ARVN forces. In January 1975, Hanoi began a 2-year offensive that soon turned into a rout, as ARVN troops fled to Saigon. On April 30th, over 20 years after the end of the First Indochina War, Saigon and the South surrendered. During that time, 2 to 3 million Indochinese were killed, over 58,000 Americans died, and 3 times the amount of bombs dropped in World War II left profound devastation. To this day, both countries suffer the effects of the war.